At our son's new house party, my wife grabbed my wrist under the dinner table and whispered that we had to go, right now. Her nails dug into my skin. I asked her why, keeping my voice low, and she only shook her head and stared at the wine glass in front of our son's business partner. She stayed completely silent until we were back in the car. Then she turned to me in the dark, her face pale under the streetlight, and she said the one thing that took the floor out from under my whole life. She said, "You didn't actually see it, did you? You didn't see whose name was on that deed." Before I tell you what she said next, and what it cost every single person at that table, do me one small favor. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if stories about family, loyalty, and the quiet strength it takes to fight back mean something to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Old Lion Stories. To understand how a housewarming party became the night I lost my son and found out who I really was, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. My name is Walter Ashford. I am 69 years old, and for 41 years I built things that were meant to last. I was a structural engineer, bridges mostly in the earlier years, and then commercial towers once the firm moved me into high-rise work. I spent my whole career learning one hard lesson over and over. A structure does not fail where you are looking. It fails at the connection you trusted so completely that you stopped checking it. The weld you assumed was sound. The bolt someone signed off on without torquing. The load path everyone believed carried straight to the ground when it actually dead-ended in thin air. I gave 4 decades to the principle that trust, unverified, is the most dangerous material in any building. I should have remembered that at my own dinner table. My wife is Margaret. We have been married for 44 years. She taught 3rd grade for most of them, and she has a way of watching a room that I used to find charming and now understand is a kind of radar. Margaret notices the child who is about to cry before the child knows it. She notices the guest who is lying before the lie is fully out of his mouth. I built my career reading steel. She built hers reading people. For most of our marriage, those 2 skills never needed to work at the same time. We had 1 son, Ethan. I want to be careful about how I describe Ethan, because it would be easy, sitting here now, to paint him as a monster from the first breath. He was not. He was a bright, quick, restless boy who wanted things faster than patience allowed. He was the kid who took apart the lawnmower to see how it worked, and then left the parts in the grass for me to find. Charming. Genuinely charming. People wanted to give Ethan things, and for a long time, I thought that was because they saw what I saw. Later I understood it was because Ethan had learned, very young, exactly how to make a person feel like the most important human in the room for as long as he needed something from them. He went into commercial real estate development. It suited him. Big projects, big personalities, big money moving in ways that were mostly invisible until the ribbon got cut. Margaret and I were proud. We told ourselves the restlessness had found a home. Ethan married a woman named Priscilla 11 years ago. I will try to be fair to Priscilla too, though it is harder. She came from money, or from the appearance of money, which in her family were treated as the same thing. Her father, Grant Holloway, ran a private investment fund that everyone in their social circle spoke about, in hushed, reverent tones, and that no one, I would eventually learn, could actually explain. Priscilla was polished in a way that took me years to see through. Every kindness she offered had a small hook set in it. Every compliment doubled as a measurement. When she looked at our modest house, at Margaret's hand-me-down china, at my 20-year-old car in the driveway, she smiled and said how wonderfully authentic it all was. I took it as warmth for far too long. For the first several years, none of this mattered, because none of it touched us. Ethan and Priscilla lived their glittering life an hour away in the city. We saw them at holidays. Priscilla air-kissed Margaret's cheek and admired things in that measuring way, and Grant Holloway shook my hand with a grip that was always a half-second too firm, like he was testing a railing. We went home after each visit a little tired, and told ourselves that was just how the young ones lived now. Fast, loud, expensive. We had raised a son who reached higher than we had, and if the air up there was thinner than we liked, well, that was the price of watching your child climb. Then Margaret got sick. Not the sickness you are bracing for. She is alive. She is sitting in the next room as I record this, and if she heard me making this sound more dramatic than it was, she would tell me to get to the point. But 4 years ago, Margaret was diagnosed with a heart condition that required surgery, and the surgery required a long recovery, and the long recovery required money that our savings could cover, but only if we were careful for the rest of our lives. We were prepared to be careful. We had always been careful. That is how 2 school teachers and engineers end up owning their house outright and carrying no debt at 69. Careful was our native language. What we were not prepared for was Ethan's offer. He came to the hospital the day after Margaret's surgery. He sat beside her bed and held her hand and cried, real tears, and I remember thinking that whatever complaints I had about the life my son had chosen, at least the boy still loved his mother. And then, in the hallway afterward, he put his arm around my shoulders and told me he wanted to help. He said he hated watching us pinch pennies at our age. He said he had a way to make our money work harder so that Mom would never have to worry about a medical bill again. I want you to understand the exact shape of what he proposed, because the whole story turns on it. Ethan told me that his firm was raising capital for a development project, a mixed-use property, retail below and residences above, in a part of the city that was, in his words, about to explode. He said the returns were extraordinary. He said the fund his father-in-law ran was the lead investor, and that Grant only brought family and close friends into deals like this. He said that for us, for Mom and Dad, he could get us in at the ground floor. All we had to do was move a portion of our savings into the fund. He would handle everything. We wouldn't have to understand a word of it. That was, he said, the whole point of having a son in the business. Margaret from the hospital bed said no. I need to be honest about this, because it is the part I have replayed 10,000 times. Margaret said no, and I said yes. She did not trust it. She could not have told you why, not with any evidence, but her radar was pinging and she wanted nothing to do with Grant Holloway's fund. And I, the man who spent 41 years preaching that you never trust a connection you haven't personally inspected, overruled my wife, because the connection in question was my own son, and I could not bring myself to inspect my own son. We put in $240,000. It was not all our money. I want to be clear about that, because people hear a number like that and assume we handed over everything. We did not. We kept the house free and clear, kept an emergency reserve, kept enough to live, but $240,000 was the great majority of our liquid savings, the number that was supposed to be Margaret's safety net, and I moved it into a fund I did not understand, on the word of a son I loved more than I checked. For the first 2 years, it looked like the best decision I had ever made. The statements came quarterly, on heavy paper, with Grant Holloway's fund logo embossed at the top. The numbers climbed, not wildly, not in a way that screamed fraud to a man who wanted to believe, just steadily, reassuringly upward, 8%, 9%, a touch over 10 in a good quarter. Ethan would call after each statement and walk us through it in his warm, patient voice, and I would hang up feeling like a fool for ever having doubted, and like a slightly better father for having trusted my boy. Margaret read every statement in silence and said nothing, but she kept them. She kept every single one in a folder in the bottom drawer of her desk, and at the time, I thought she was just being organized. I did not understand that my wife had been quietly building a case file for 2 years, out of an instinct she could not name. The party was for the new house. Ethan and Priscilla had bought a place that I can only describe as obscene. Not to me, to anyone. It sat on 3 acres in the most expensive suburb in the state, 7 bedrooms, a wine cellar, a pool that curved around the back of the house like a moat. Ethan called it the payoff. He said the development had done so well that he and Priscilla had finally bought the home they deserved, and he wanted to throw a housewarming party. And of course Mom and Dad had to be there, because none of it would have been possible without the family who believed in him. That last part, in hindsight, was the only completely true thing he said all night. The party was the kind of event where you understand immediately that you are the poorest people in the room. Valet parking in a residential driveway, a string quartet by the pool, waiters in white jackets, carrying trays of things I could not identify. Priscilla floated through it, in a dress that cost more than my first car, air-kissing and measuring, and Grant Holloway held court by the wine cellar, telling a circle of admirers about markets and moments and opportunities, in that voice that promised everything and specified nothing. Margaret and I stood near the edge of it, holding glasses of wine we weren't drinking, and I felt Ethan's whole life close over my head like water. I remember thinking, with a father's simple pride, that my restless boy had finally built something that would last. Then Margaret went looking for the bathroom, and she took a wrong turn, and she found the study. I did not see what she saw. I only know what she told me in the car, and what we confirmed together in the weeks after. But Margaret, wandering down a hallway lined with framed renderings of the very development we had invested in, stopped in front of an open door. Inside was a study, and on the wall of the study, framed like a trophy, was the property deed to the new house. And my wife, who reads people the way I read load paths, looked at that deed and understood in one instant what 2 years of embossed statements had been built to hide. The house was not paid for out of the development's profits. The house was collateralized against the development itself, and the development, according to the fine print Margaret could see, even from the doorway, was not owned by Grant Holloway's fund at all. It was owned by a holding company, and the holding company's registered agent, listed right there on the framed document, because Ethan was arrogant enough to hang it on his wall, was a name Margaret recognized from our own quarterly statements. A name that was supposed to be the fund managing our money. It was the same entity. The fund that held our $240,000 and the company that owned Ethan's development were the same, which meant our safety net had not been invested alongside Grant Holloway. It had been fed directly into the thing that built the house we were standing in. Margaret came back to the table, white as paper. She grabbed my wrist. She said we had to go. And in the car, when I asked her why, she asked me if I had actually seen it. The deed, the name. I said I hadn't seen anything. She said, "Walter, our money bought this house, not the returns. The money itself, it's gone. It was gone the day we sent it. Everything since has been paper." I want to tell you that I believed her instantly. I did not. I am ashamed of that. But this is an honest account, so I will tell you the truth. My first reaction, sitting in the dark outside my son's mansion, was to defend him. I told Margaret she was tired, that she had misread a legal document she'd glimpsed from a doorway, that Ethan would never. She let me finish. Then she reached into her purse and took out her phone, and she showed me the photograph she had taken of the framed deed before she walked away. 44 years of marriage, and I had still underestimated the woman I slept next to every night. The photograph was clear, and I am an engineer. I read documents for a living. It took me under a minute sitting in that car to understand that my wife was right about all of it, and that I had made the single worst decision of my life the day I overruled her from a hospital hallway. That was the night the old man went quiet. I did not rage. I did not call Ethan. I did not storm back into that party and flip a table, which is what a younger man might have done, and what a part of me screamed to do. I sat in the dark, and I felt something old and cold settle over me. Something I had not felt in decades, since the years when I fought contractors who wanted to cut corners on structures that would hold human lives. There is an old thing about lions that I have always known. A lion does not chase the whole herd. A lion goes still. It watches. It lets the herd forget it is there, and then it moves once, at exactly the right moment, and the moving is over, almost before it begins. I had spent my whole life being the reliable one, the careful one, the one who trusted his son. I decided, in that car, to become something else, for exactly as long as it took. I decided to let them believe I had seen nothing at all. The next morning, I called Ethan and told him what a wonderful party it had been. I want you to sit with how that felt. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where I had taught that boy to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, 40 years ago. And I told my son that Margaret and I had gone home glowing. I told him the house was magnificent. I told him we were so proud we could hardly speak. Every word was a small betrayal of the truth, and I laid them down carefully, one after another, the way I used to lay down the sequence of a controlled demolition. You do not bring a structure down by hitting it hardest where it is strongest. You place small charges at the exact points where the whole thing is holding itself up, and then you let gravity do the rest. Ethan laughed, warm and pleased, and said he was glad. He said we should come back soon. He said there might even be another opportunity coming, a second phase of the development, and he'd love to get Mom and Dad in on it before it filled up. I said that sounded wonderful. I said I would have to look at what we had available. And I heard it. In that half-second pause before he answered, I heard the thing I had been listening for. A small, hungry stillness. My son was not offering me a second opportunity because he wanted to share his success. My son was probing to find out whether there was any more money in the Ashford accounts to be moved into the machine. He was checking the strength of a connection to see how much more load it would bear before it failed. I told him I would think about it. Then I hung up, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I began to plan the most important project of my life. The first thing I did was become old. I do not mean I became frail. I mean I made a decision to let everyone who was watching me see exactly what they expected to see. A confused, grieving, aging father, rattled by his wife's illness, out of his depth in a financial world he had never understood, grateful to his brilliant son for handling things he could not follow. It was not a large performance. That was the genius of it, if I can call it that without sounding proud. I did not have to invent a character. I only had to lean into the version of me that Ethan and Priscilla and Grant Holloway already believed in. When Ethan called, I fumbled with the terms. I asked him to explain what a holding company was, twice, in the same conversation, and I heard the small satisfaction in his voice as he explained it to his simple old father. When Priscilla asked, in her measuring way, whether Margaret's medical bills were putting a strain on us, I let my voice go thin and worried and said we were managing, that Ethan's investment had been such a blessing that I didn't know what we would have done without it. I watched her file that away. I watched her decide that the Ashfords were tapped out and harmless, a closed account, nothing left to extract. Being underestimated, I discovered, is a kind of armor. Once they were certain I was weak, they stopped guarding themselves against me. And a man they have stopped guarding against can walk anywhere. Margaret was my partner in all of it, and I need to give her that, because for 2 years I had let her sit silent, with her folder of statements, while I trusted the wrong people. Now I finally listened to her. We sat at the kitchen table night after night, and she laid out everything she had noticed over the years, every small wrongness she had catalogued and said nothing about, and I laid out everything I now understood about how the fraud was structured, and together we began to build the case that neither of us could have built alone. Here is what we knew, and here is how we came to know it. We knew from Margaret's photograph that our fund and Ethan's development were the same underlying entity. That was the keystone. But a photograph of a framed deed is not proof of a crime. It is a starting point. What we needed was the paper trail underneath it, the flow of money from our account into that entity and then out again into Ethan's house, his cars, Priscilla's life. We needed to prove that the quarterly statements were fiction, that the returns we had been shown were numbers typed onto embossed paper, with nothing real behind them. I still had one advantage they had all forgotten about. I had spent 41 years reading technical documents, financial disclosures, engineering contracts, thick with the kind of language designed to make ordinary people stop reading. Ethan thought I couldn't understand a holding company. The truth was that I had signed my name to construction contracts, more complex than anything in Grant Holloway's fund, and I had learned, the hard way, on a bridge project in my 30s, exactly what it looks like when the paperwork is hiding the fact that the money isn't where it's supposed to be. So I asked Ethan for the fund's disclosure documents. I did it gently. I did it as the confused old man who wanted to make sure everything was in order for Mom, in case anything happened to me. I said I wanted to get our affairs organized, that at my age, you start thinking about these things, and that I'd feel better having all the paperwork on the investment in one place. It was the most natural request in the world from an aging father, and it would have been suspicious for Ethan to refuse it. So he didn't. He had his assistant send over a package of documents, and I am certain he never imagined that the man reading them had spent his career finding the one load-bearing lie in 1,000 pages of reassurance. It took me 3 weeks. I read those documents the way I used to inspect a completed structure, before signing off on it, slowly, twice, then a third time, looking specifically for the places where the story the documents told did not match the story the numbers told. And on the third pass, I found it. I found the connection that was carrying the entire fraud, the point where, if you knew where to look, the whole thing was holding itself up on nothing. The fund reported its returns based on the appraised value of its holdings. That is not unusual in itself, but the appraisals were being performed by a company that, when I traced its ownership through 3 layers of shells, turned out to be controlled by Grant Holloway. The fund was paying a company Grant owned to tell investors how much the fund's assets were worth. And the assets, when I finally understood what they actually were almost entirely Ethan's development. A development that had, in reality, never leased more than 1/3 of its retail space, and had missed its residential sales targets by a margin that would have been catastrophic if any investor had ever seen the real numbers. The returns were not returns. There were no profits. Grant's captive appraisal company simply declared, every quarter, that the development was worth more than it had been the quarter before, and that phantom increase was reported to us as growth. Meanwhile, the actual cash that new investors like us put in was being used to pay the small, occasional withdrawals that older investors requested, which kept everyone calm and kept the statements believable, and the rest of it flowed out to fund the lifestyle of the family running the machine. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, and I finally understood, completely and precisely, what my son was part of. It was a Ponzi scheme, not a metaphor for one. The actual thing, new money paying old money, held together by fraudulent appraisals, dressed up in embossed paper, and destined to collapse the moment the flow of new investors slowed. And I understood something else, something that made the cold thing in my chest go colder. Ethan was not just a beneficiary of it. Ethan was the mechanism. His development was the asset the whole fraud was built around. Without Ethan's project to point to, Grant Holloway had nothing to appraise. My son was not a victim who had been pulled in. My son was load-bearing. I did not sleep that night, but I did not rage either. I made coffee, and I watched the sun come up over the backyard, where I had once taught Ethan to throw a ball, and I made two decisions. The first was that I was going to bring the whole structure down, all the way to the ground, and I was going to do it in a way that recovered every dollar possible for the people who had been robbed. The second was harder. The second was that I was not going to warn my son. I need to explain that, because I know how it sounds. He was my child. Every instinct a father has told me to pull him out first, to get him clear of the collapse before it came, to save him, even if I burned everyone else. I sat with that instinct for a long time, and then I made myself look at what saving Ethan would actually mean. It would mean warning him, which would mean warning Grant, which would mean giving them time to move money, shred documents, and vanish the evidence that other families needed to get their savings back. Saving my son meant sacrificing every other victim. And there were victims. I did not yet know how many, but I knew from the scale of the fund that Margaret and I were not the only retirees who had trusted the wrong smile. I decided I could not buy my son's freedom with other people's ruin. I decided the most loving thing left to do for Ethan was to make sure that when it ended cleanly, with the truth fully out, so that whatever he had to face, he faced the real size of it, and not a version he could keep lying his way around. That was the coldest morning of my life. But by the time Margaret came into the kitchen, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to gather everything, and then I was going to find the other victims. And then I was going to walk into a room where all of them, and all the people who had robbed them, were together, and I was going to bring the whole thing down in a single afternoon. I just had to be patient. And patience, it turned out, was the one thing 41 years of watching structures hold and fail had taught me better than anything else. The first person I told was not a lawyer. It was Margaret. I told her everything, laid out completely, the full shape of the fraud and my full intention. I owed her that. I had made a $240,000 decision over her objection, once already. And I was not going to make a decision to declare war on our only son without her standing beside me as an equal. So I walked her through all of it at the kitchen table, the appraisals, the shells, the Ponzi structure, the reason I would not warn Ethan. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said the thing that told me I had married the right woman 44 years ago. She said, "I've known something was wrong for 2 years, Walter. I just didn't know what. If we do this, we do it all the way. No half measures. If we're going to break my son's heart, and mine, then it had better be worth it. It had better help every other person he helped rob." That was the moment the two of us stopped being victims and started being something else. The second person I told was Frank Delgado. Frank had been my friend for 30 years. We met on a bridge project when he was the county's outside counsel and I was the engineer of record, and we had bonded over a shared hatred of people who signed off on things they hadn't checked. Frank had left public work years ago and built a small, ferocious practice specializing in financial fraud and elder exploitation. He was semi-retired now, or claimed to be, but I knew Frank. And I knew that the fastest way to unretire the man was to put a real fraud in front of him and tell him people's savings were on the line. I drove out to his house on a Tuesday, and I laid it all on his dining room table. Margaret's photograph, the disclosure documents, my 3 weeks of notes tracing the shell companies, the appraisal scheme, everything. Frank read for 2 hours without saying a word. When he finally looked up, His face had the expression I remembered from the bridge fights, the one that meant someone was about to have a very bad year. He said, "Walter, do you understand what you've actually found here?" I said I thought I did. He said, "No, listen to me. What most people bring me is a bad investment. A guy who lost money, feels cheated, wants someone to blame. What you've brought me is a documented, structured securities fraud, with a captive appraisal engine and a paper trail you've already half-traced yourself. This isn't a lawsuit. This is a federal case, and the fact that your son is inside it doesn't shrink it. It makes it bigger, because it means the fraud has a family running it, which means there are almost certainly more victims recruited exactly the way you were, through trust, through family, through people who couldn't imagine their own son would do this to them." Then Frank said the sentence that organized the next 4 months of my life. He said, "We don't just take this to the authorities, we take it to them complete. We find the other victims, we get their accounts, we build the whole picture, and we hand it over as a finished thing, so airtight that nobody can move a dollar or shred a page before it's frozen. You've been building this like an engineer. Good. Now we finish it like one." Finding the other victims was the hardest and most delicate part of everything we did. I could not simply take out an advertisement asking whether anyone else had been defrauded by Grant Holloway's fund. That would have reached Grant and Ethan within a day, and the whole structure would have vanished. I had to find them quietly, one at a time, without anyone who was part of the machine ever knowing that questions were being asked. Frank had a way in. Securities filings and fund disclosures, even fraudulent ones, leave traces in public records, and Frank knew how to read those traces the way I read a set of structural drawings. Over 6 weeks, working carefully, he and I assembled a list of people who appeared to have money in Grant Holloway's fund. It was not a long list. That was part of the fraud's design. A small circle of trusting people, mostly older, mostly recruited through family or church, or the country club, is far easier to keep calm than a crowd. There were 11 of them, besides us. I want to tell you about 2 of them, because they are the reason I never once wavered after this point, on even the hardest nights. One was a woman named Dorothy Keller. She was 76, a retired nurse, a widow, and she had been brought into the fund by her nephew, who worked for Ethan. She had put in $110,000, which was, I would learn when I finally sat across from her, very close to everything she had. She still worked 2 days a week at a pharmacy, at 76, because the returns she thought she was earning were being quietly reinvested by her nephew, on the fund's advice, so that she never actually withdrew the phantom gains and never discovered they weren't real. She thought she was being prudent. She thought she was leaving something for her grandchildren. She was, in fact, funding Priscilla's dress. The other was a man named Harold Winters, 72, a retired high school principal, who had put in $90,000 of his pension savings after Grant Holloway spoke at a charity dinner and made him feel, Harold told me later, like he was being let in on something special. Harold had recently started asking the fund to return some of his money, because his wife needed a procedure. The fund had been stalling him for 2 months with paperwork and delays. Harold thought it was bureaucracy. It was not bureaucracy. It was the sound a Ponzi scheme makes when the new money starts running out. When Frank and I understood that people like Dorothy and Harold were being ground up inside this thing, and that the machine was already starting to stall on withdrawals, we understood something urgent. The collapse was coming, whether we acted or not. A Ponzi scheme is a structure that is falling the entire time it stands. The only question was whether it would collapse in a way that let the guilty escape and left the victims with nothing, or whether we could bring it down in a controlled way, all at once, with the evidence preserved and the money traced. We chose controlled demolition. Approaching the other victims required a level of care I had never asked of myself before. Frank counseled me that we could not simply call these people and tell them they'd been robbed. Some of them might panic and confront the fund, which would blow everything. Some of them might be so enmeshed with the family member who recruited them that they'd warn exactly the wrong person. We had to approach each one individually, privately, with proof already in hand, and we had to give each of them a reason to stay silent until the day we moved. So that is what I did. Over the following weeks, I sat in living rooms and coffee shops and, once, in the back booth of a diner at 9 in the morning, and I told 11 strangers, gently and with documents in front of them, that the money they thought they had was gone. I watched 11 people's faces do the thing my own had done in the car outside Ethan's house. The refusal first, then the dawning, then, in almost every case, a terrible quiet. Dorothy Keller cried, without making any sound at all, and then she wiped her face and asked me one question. She asked whether her nephew had known. I had to tell her the truth, which was that I didn't know yet, but that we were going to find out, and that if he had known, he would answer for it too, family or not. She nodded slowly and said, "Then let's make sure." She was 76 years old, and she signed on to help me without a second's hesitation. Not everyone did. 2 of the 11 did not believe me, or did not want to, and asked me to leave. I did not push them. Frank had warned me some would refuse, and that we could not afford to argue, because an argument might become a phone call to the wrong person. So I thanked them for their time and left, and I made sure our plan did not depend on them. 9 victims, plus Margaret and me, 11 households ready to move together. It was enough. But we still did not have the one thing that would turn a strong civil case and a promising federal referral into something no defense lawyer on earth could untangle. We did not have anyone in the machine admitting, in their own words, that they knew it was a fraud. I had documents proving the structure was fraudulent. What I did not have was proof of intent. A clever lawyer, and Grant Holloway could afford very clever lawyers, would argue that the appraisals were made in good faith, that the shell structure was ordinary tax planning, that everyone genuinely believed the development would succeed and the returns would materialize. Fraud requires knowledge. I needed one of them to say, out loud, that they knew, and that meant I needed to get close to the machine again, close enough to hear it speak honestly. The opportunity came from the thing I had planted months earlier, in that first phone call after the party, when I had let Ethan believe there might be more Ashford money to move. I called Ethan and told him I was ready to talk about the second phase. I told him Margaret and I had been thinking hard about our future, and about her health, and that we had decided we wanted to do everything we could to grow what we had, while we still could. I said I had been looking at our finances, and that there was more available than I'd first thought. I let a number hang in the air. I said we might be able to put in another 150,000, maybe more, if the opportunity was as good as he'd said. The stillness on the other end of the line was the hungriest I had ever heard it. Ethan said that was wonderful. He said it was exactly the right instinct. He said the second phase was filling fast, but that of course he would make room for Mom and Dad, and that Grant himself would want to be involved in bringing family in on a deal this size. He said we should all sit down together. He said, "Why don't you and Mom come to the house, and I'll have Grant and Priscilla there, and we'll walk you through everything over dinner." That was what I had been waiting for. Not just Ethan. All 3 of them, in one room, comfortable, unguarded, believing they were reeling in one last piece of a helpless old couple's savings. I said that sounded perfect. I said we would love to. Then I hung up, and I called Frank, and I told him it was happening, and I asked him the question I had been dreading. I asked him what was legal, because I need to be completely honest with you about this part. My instinct was to walk into that dinner wired, recording everything, capturing every word. And Frank stopped me. Frank explained, carefully, the laws about recording conversations, which vary by state, and which I am not going to pretend to lecture anyone about, because I am an engineer and not a lawyer, and the details matter enormously. What Frank told me was that we were fortunate to live in a state where a person who is part of a conversation may record it, and that because I would be a participant in the dinner, sitting right there at the table, a recording I made of my own conversation was something we could use. He was insistent on the boundaries. He told me exactly what I could and could not do. I could record a conversation I was part of. I could not plant a device in a room and leave it to capture other people talking without me. The difference sounds small. Legally, Frank told me, it is the difference between evidence and a crime, and he was not going to let me save our savings by committing one. So we did it the careful way, the way that was clean, the way that would survive a courtroom. The dinner was on a Thursday. Margaret and I drove out to the enormous house together, and I remember she reached over at a stoplight and held my hand, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing to say that we hadn't already said. We were about to sit down to dinner with our son and pretend to be the people he thought we were, one last time, so that we could gather the words that would end everything. I played the confused old father better that night than I had ever played him. I asked Grant Holloway to explain the second phase to me slowly. I furrowed my brow. I said I wanted to understand it for Margaret's sake, in case anything happened to me. And Grant Holloway, expansive and confident at the head of my son's dining table, with a glass of wine that cost more than Dorothy Keller's weekly pharmacy wages, explained the opportunity to the simple old man in front of him. And then, because they were so certain I could not follow it, they got careless. It started when I asked what I thought was an innocent question. I asked how the returns had stayed so strong when I'd read in the paper that commercial real estate was struggling. I asked it as a worried old man, seeking reassurance. And Grant Holloway smiled and glanced at Ethan, and something passed between them, a small private amusement, and Grant said not to worry about the papers, that the fund had ways of managing value that the general market didn't understand. I said I didn't understand it either, and Priscilla laughed. Priscilla, who had measured my wife's china for 11 years, laughed and said, "Walter, that's rather the point, isn't it?" It unspooled from there, and I will tell you what was said as closely as I can, because I have listened to it many times since. Grant, warmed by wine and by the certainty that he was among family and fools, explained to Ethan, as if I were furniture, that the appraisal on the second phase needed to come in high enough to cover the first phase shortfall, or the quarterly statements would start to look thin. He said it lightly. He said it the way you'd discuss adjusting a thermostat. Ethan, my son, my boy, nodded and said he'd already talked to the appraiser, and it was handled, that the number would come in wherever they needed it to. Priscilla said something then that I have not been able to stop hearing. She said the timing with us was perfect, meaning Margaret and me, because our new money would cover the winter's withdrawal that had been dragging on, and once that was paid, Harold would stop making noise. She said it, and then she sipped her wine. They were discussing, at my son's dinner table, in front of me, how the savings I was pretending to offer them would be used to pay off another victim to keep him quiet. They named the fraudulent appraisal. They named the shortfall. They named the mechanism. Grant Holloway actually said, and this is close to word for word, that the beauty of it was that people like us never asked the right questions because we were too grateful to be included. I sat there, and I asked one more confused question, and I let them explain the whole thing to me one more time, more completely, because I wanted no ambiguity in any of it. And they did. They laid the entire scheme out across that table, like men who could not conceive of a world in which the old fool across from them was anything other than an old fool. I want to describe what I felt, because it was not triumph. I had what I needed. I understood that in the moment, that the case was now complete, that every clever lawyer's argument about good faith had just been demolished by the people paying those lawyers. And I felt no joy at all. I felt grief. Because up until that dinner, some small, stupid, fatherly part of me had still been holding out hope that Ethan was a victim too, that he had been pulled in, used, kept in the dark like the rest of us. And across that table, listening to my son calmly discuss which retiree's savings would pay off which other retiree, I finally let that hope die. Margaret's hand found my knee under the table and squeezed once. She had heard it too. She knew what it was costing me. And she knew, because she was stronger than me, and always had been, that I could not let a single thing show on my face. So I smiled. I told Grant it all sounded remarkable. I told Ethan we were in, that we'd move the money the following week. I shook Grant Holloway's too firm hand, and I hugged my son, and I felt him hug me back, warm and easy, my boy. And I held it together until Margaret and I were in the car and a mile down the road. Then I pulled over, and I put my head against the wheel, and for the first time since the party, the old lion made a sound. Not a roar, just grief, in the dark, at what my son had let himself become. Margaret held me. She let me have it, the whole thing, for as long as I needed. And then, when I was done, she said the words that put the steel back in my spine. She said, "Now we finish it. For Dorothy, for Harold, for everyone at that table who they think is furniture. We finish it, Walter, and we make it count." I straightened up. I wiped my face, and I drove us home to make the last preparations, because I finally had every piece I needed, and it was time to bring the whole structure down. I thought I understood the full size of it. I did not. Frank and I met the day after the dinner to go over everything I had gathered, and I gave him my account of what had been said, and I watched his face as he realized what we now had. He said the intent problem was solved. He said that between the documents and the conversation, we had crossed the line from a strong case to an overwhelming one. And then he said we needed to make the referral to the authorities, carefully and soon, because the fraud was clearly straining, and he wanted the evidence in official hands before it collapsed on its own. But Frank, being Frank, wanted to do one more pass through the financials before we handed everything over. He said that when you finally have a fraud cornered, you always find that it is bigger than you thought, because people who lie about one thing lie about everything, and the first fraud is almost never the only one. He wanted to trace the money one more layer down, past Ethan's development, into whatever Grant Holloway had built underneath it. What he found took the whole thing from a financial crime to something that made me physically ill. It started with the appraisal company, the captive one Grant controlled, the engine that generated the phantom values. Frank pulled its filings and traced its other clients, because a company like that rarely serves only one master. And he found that Grant Holloway's appraisal company had also been providing valuations for something else entirely, a set of assisted living facilities, 3 of them, in neighboring counties, owned through yet another holding company in the same tangle of shells. At first, we did not understand why that mattered. An investment fund owning senior care facilities is not, by itself, a crime. But Frank kept pulling threads, and the more he pulled, the worse it got. The assisted living facilities were being used as collateral. Grant had borrowed heavily against them, tens of millions, using his own inflated appraisals to justify loans far larger than the facilities were actually worth. That was fraud against the lenders, serious in itself, but it was what the borrowed money had been used for, and what was happening inside those facilities as a result, that turned my stomach. The money borrowed against the senior facilities had been funneled, through the shells, into propping up the Ponzi scheme. The facilities themselves, meanwhile, were being starved. To keep the debt payments current on loans that were far too large, Grant's operation had been systematically cutting costs inside the 3 facilities where actual elderly people actually lived. Staff reductions, deferred maintenance, cheaper food, fewer nurses on the night shift than the law required. Frank found records of complaints, of citations, of a regulatory file that was thick with warnings, all of it buried because the people running the facilities answered to a holding company that answered to Grant, and Grant needed every dollar he could squeeze out of those buildings to feed the machine. I need to be careful here, because this is the part where the story stops being only about money. There were people in those facilities, old people Margaret's and my age and older, people someone's children had entrusted to what they believed was safe, professional care. And the safety of that care had been quietly hollowed out, one budget cut at a time, so that a private investment fund could keep a fraudulent scheme alive long enough for the people running it to build mansions and buy dresses. Frank found, in the regulatory file, references to incidents, falls that happened because there wasn't enough night staff, a medication error, a resident who wandered out of an understaffed memory unit. I am not going to detail those incidents, because the families of those people deserve their privacy, and their grief is not mine to display. But I read enough to understand that Grant Holloway's fraud had not just stolen money, it had reached into the lives of vulnerable, elderly strangers and made them less safe so that the numbers could keep working. And Ethan was inside that structure, my son. I did not know, and I have never been fully able to determine how much Ethan understood about the senior facilities specifically. It is possible he knew only about the development and the fund, and never looked closely at the rest of Grant's tangle. I have wanted to believe that. A father wants to believe his son would not knowingly starve a nursing home to pay for a pool. But I had learned, at that dinner table, exactly how much my son was willing to not know when knowing would have been inconvenient, and I could no longer give him the benefit of a doubt I had already watched him exploit. When Frank finished tracing it all, he sat back and was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have thought about often since. He said, "Walter, you came to me to get your savings back. I want you to understand that this isn't about your savings anymore. This is about people who can't fight for themselves at all, in 3 buildings you've never seen, who are being hurt right now to keep this thing standing. Whatever you were willing to do to get your $240,000 back, you need to be willing to do more, because there are people in this who have far more at stake than money, and they don't have an engineer for a father." That reframed everything for me. From that moment, it was not about the Ashfords at all. It was not even mainly about Dorothy and Harold and the 9 households anymore, though they mattered enormously. It was about the fact that I had, almost by accident, uncovered something that was actively harming people who had no idea it was happening and no way to stop it. And I was, as far as I could tell, the only person outside the fraud who understood the whole shape of it. I want to tell you that I felt heroic. I did not. I felt the weight of it, which is a different thing. I was 69. I had wanted, more than anything, a quiet retirement with Margaret, a garden, some grandchildren I now realized I might never have. Instead, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, understanding that if I did not see this all the way through, correctly and completely, people I would never meet would keep getting hurt. Margaret and I talked about it that night, for a long time, and I told her about the facilities, and I watched the retired schoolteacher's face harden in a way I had rarely seen. She had spent her career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, small ones in her case. But the instinct is the same at both ends of a life, she said. We are absolutely doing this, and we are doing it right, And I don't care what it costs us, or what it costs Ethan. Those people cannot wait. The urgency changed our timeline. Frank had wanted to take a few more weeks to assemble the perfect package. But the discovery of the senior facilities meant that every week we waited was a week those facilities stayed starved, and those residents stayed at risk. So we compressed everything. Frank made contact with the authorities he trusted, the ones who handle exactly this kind of financial crime, and he did it in a way that protected the evidence and made clear that vulnerable people were in ongoing danger, which changes how quickly these things move. I am not going to pretend I understand the machinery of what happened next inside various agencies, because I don't, and I am wary of the kind of storyteller who claims to know exactly how investigations work. What I can tell you is what I experienced. I experienced a period of a few weeks where Frank and I met with serious people in quiet offices and handed over everything we had, box by box, and answered questions, and were told very little in return. I learned that when you bring the authorities a case that is already this complete, and that involves ongoing harm to vulnerable people, they can move faster than the stories usually suggest. I also learned that I had to keep playing my part right up until the end. Because here is the thing about a controlled demolition. You cannot let the structure know it is being wired. All through those final weeks, while Frank and I worked with the authorities, I had to keep being the confused old father to Ethan. I had to keep the second phase money dangling, keep promising I'd move it soon, keep making small excuses about paperwork and timing, so that neither Ethan nor Grant nor Priscilla suspected that the ground had already been prepared beneath them. It was the hardest acting of my life, harder than the dinner, because now I knew everything, and I had to hug my son on the phone and tell him I loved him, and hang up and go back to helping build the case that would end him. There was a night, near the end, when Ethan called just to talk. Not about money, just to talk, the way he used to when he was younger. Before all of it, he told me about a memory, some fishing trip we'd taken when he was 10, and he laughed about it, and for 20 minutes I had my son back, the real one, the boy who took apart the lawnmower, and I sat on the phone in the dark, and I loved him with my whole chest, and I knew that in a matter of days, I was going to help bring his entire life down around him, and that both of those things were true at the same time, and that being a father sometimes means holding two things that should not be able to exist together. When I hung up, Margaret asked if I was all right. I said no. She said good. She said, if this were easy, we'd be the wrong people to do it. Then Frank called and told me the authorities were ready to move, and that there was one more thing they wanted, and it was the thing that would become the afternoon I will remember until I die. They wanted the confrontation to happen in a controlled setting, with everyone present, at a moment the authorities could coordinate around. And the perfect moment had, as if the universe had a sense of structure too, presented itself. Grant Holloway was hosting an investor event. It was to be a formal dinner at a country club, a celebration of the fund's success, an evening designed to reassure existing investors and charm new ones into the second phase. Grant had invited his whole circle. He had invited Ethan and Priscilla. He had, through Ethan, invited Margaret and me, as the newest happy family joining the fold, a living advertisement for how the fund took care of its own. He had, without knowing it, gathered every single person into one room, the victims, the perpetrators, the paper, and the old man he thought was furniture. Frank looked at me across his desk when he told me where and when it would be. And he said, "Walter, they've built you the room. All you have to do is walk into it." The days before that dinner were the longest of my life. There was a great deal to prepare, and almost none of it was mine to do, which was its own kind of torture. The authorities had their process. Frank had his coordination with them. My job, the job of the man who had built the entire case, was now mostly to wait, and to keep the confused old father performance running flawlessly for a few more days, and to make sure the 9 other households were ready. That last part I took seriously. I called each of them, or Frank did, and we made sure they understood what was going to happen and what was expected of them. Most of them were not going to be in the room. The dinner was Grant's event, his invitation list, and only Margaret and I among the victims had been invited, precisely because Grant thought of us as fresh converts, rather than as marks who had already figured it out. So the other victims would not witness the moment itself, but they needed to be ready for what came after, ready to come forward, ready to provide their account and their documents the instant the thing broke open. Dorothy Keller asked me if it was really going to happen. She had been let down her whole life by promises, I think, and she wanted to know if this old man who had appeared in her living room was actually going to do what he said. I told her yes. I told her to keep her phone close on the night I named, and that when she got the call, it would mean it was done, and that her fight to get her money back could finally begin in the open. She was quiet, and then she said, "My late husband would have liked you, Walter." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, but I have kept it. Margaret and I decided what we would wear to the dinner the way you decide what to wear to a funeral. Because that is what it was, in a way. It was the funeral of my relationship with my son, and we both knew it, and we dressed for it, with a strange, sad formality. Margaret wore the blue dress I have always loved. I wore my good suit, the one I'd bought for my retirement party. We stood in front of the mirror together, 2 people in their late 60s who had been married for 44 years, and Margaret took my hand and said, "Whatever happens tonight, we walk in together, and we walk out together. Everything else can break. Not that. I have held on to a lot of things Margaret said during those months. That one most of all." We arrived at the country club at 7. It was exactly the kind of event you would imagine. A private dining room, round tables with heavy linen, a bar in the corner, the fund's logo projected discreetly onto one wall, perhaps 40 people, most of them Grant's age or older, the men in blazers and the women in careful jewelry, all of them radiating the comfortable certainty of people who believe their money is safe. I looked around that room, and I understood that many of them were probably victims too. People whose accounts hadn't surfaced in Frank's search. People who were about to have the worst night of their retirement. I felt for them, but I also knew that the only way to protect all of them, in the end, was to let it break tonight, cleanly, with the evidence preserved. Grant Holloway worked the room like the master he was. He found us within minutes, took Margaret's hand in both of his, told her she looked radiant, clapped me on the shoulder, and announced to the couple beside us that here were the Ashfords, the newest members of the family, a wonderful couple who understood the value of trust. I shook his too firm hand and I smiled, and I said we were delighted to be there. Every word of it a small charge, carefully placed. Ethan and Priscilla arrived a little after us. My son crossed the room to hug me, and I hugged him back, and I held it a half-second longer than I meant to, because some part of me knew it was the last time I would ever hug him as a free man who still believed his father was on his side. He pulled back and looked at me, and for a moment I thought he saw something in my face, some crack in the performance. He said, "You okay, Dad?" And I said I was just proud of him, which was the cruelest, true-sounding lie I have ever told. And also, in a way I cannot fully explain, not entirely a lie, because I was grieving the son I could have been proud of, and grief and pride wear the same face sometimes. We sat, dinner was served, Grant stood to speak. I want to describe Grant Holloway's speech, because it was, in its way, the most damning thing he could have done, and he did it entirely to himself. He stood at the front of that room, glass in hand, and he told 40 trusting people a story about safety. He talked about how the fund was different, how it protected its investors, how in an uncertain world he had built something certain. He talked about family. He used that word again and again, family. And he gestured to Ethan, his son-in-law and partner, and he gestured to Margaret and me, the newest additions, and he said that the fund was not really an investment at all, but a family that looked after its own. The people in that room applauded him. They believed him. And I sat there and understood that I was about to detonate all of it, and that these applauding people would, in time, thank me for it, even though tonight, some of them would hate me for ruining the evening. Grant raised his glass for a toast. And that was the moment. I need to tell you exactly how it happened, because it did not happen the way it happens in the movies, and I am glad it didn't. I did not stand up and make a speech. I did not fling documents across the room. What happened was quieter, and, I think, far more devastating. As Grant raised his glass, the doors at the back of the room opened. Several people came in. They did not shout. They moved with the calm, unhurried purpose of people who have done this many times and who hold all the authority in the room without needing to raise their voices. Frank was with them, off to the side, and he caught my eye once and gave me the smallest nod. It was the nod that meant the demolition was underway and that all I had to do now was stay in my seat and let it happen. Grant faltered mid-toast. He was too experienced not to sense immediately that something was wrong. The room, which a moment before had been warm and certain, began to fill with the particular silence of 40 people, realizing at once that they do not understand what is happening. The people who had entered identified themselves. I am not going to dramatize the specific words, because the reality of it was more sober and more crushing than any dramatization. They were there regarding the fund. They named Grant Holloway. And then, and this is the part I had known was coming and had still not been ready for, they named Ethan. I watched my son's face as he heard his own name. I will never forget it. For one instant he did not understand. Then he did. And the thing I saw move across his face was not fear, not at first. It was a desperate, flashing calculation. The same look he'd had as a boy when he'd broken something and was deciding which lie would work. He looked around the room for an exit, for an angle, for a way to make it not be true, and there was none, because his father, the furniture, had spent 4 months making absolutely certain there would be none. Priscilla stood up. I think she meant to protest, to summon the outrage of a wealthy woman who assumes rules bend for her. She got out perhaps 3 words about how there had been some mistake and how they would be calling their attorney. And then she saw the documents in Frank's hand, and she saw the faces of the people who had come through the doors, and she understood that this was not a misunderstanding, that money and confidence could dissolve. She sat back down slowly. The measuring look was gone from her face, for the first time in the 11 years I had known her. What was left was just fear. Grant Holloway tried to be the master of the room one last time. He set down his glass, and he spread his hands, and he began to say, in his most reasonable and expansive voice, that this was all a terrible confusion, that he would be happy to clear it up, that everyone should please stay calm and enjoy their dinner. He was still trying to run the con even then, still certain that his voice could reshape reality the way it had reshaped it for so many years. And that was when I finally moved. I did not do anything dramatic. I simply stood up, at my table, an old man in his retirement suit, and the room's attention swung toward me, because I was the only person moving with any purpose. Grant looked at me, and there was a flicker of confusion, because in his mind I was a mark, a prop, a grateful old fool, and grateful old fools do not stand up in the middle of their own fleecing. I looked at Grant Holloway, and then I looked at my son. I said only a few things. I had thought for a long time about what I would say, and in the end, I said very little, because the documents said everything that needed saying, and I did not want to give any of them the gift of a speech to react to. I said that I had seen the deed on Ethan's wall. I said I had understood, that night, that our money had built that house. I said I had spent 4 months since then, learning exactly what they had built, and exactly who they had hurt, and that I had given all of it to the people now standing at the back of the room. I said that I was sorry it had come to this, and that the sorry was real, and that it did not change anything. Then I looked at Ethan, and I said the only thing I said directly to my son. I said, I gave you every benefit of the doubt a father has to give, right up until the night you sat at your own table and decided which old woman's savings would pay off which old man. I heard you, Ethan. I heard all of it. And I could not let you keep doing it, not even to save you. Especially not to save you. My son looked at me, and the calculation finally drained out of his face, and what was left underneath it was just a boy who had been caught by the one person he had been most certain would never catch him. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He had explained his entire scheme, months ago, to a father he was sure was too simple to understand it, and now that father was standing in front of him, having understood all of it. Margaret stood up beside me and took my hand. Together, the two of us, we watched it end. I am not going to narrate the mechanics of what followed in that room, the specific procedures, because I did not fully understand them, and because they are not the point. The point is that it was over. The structure I had spent 4 months quietly wiring came down in the space of a few minutes, cleanly, completely, with the evidence preserved and the guilty present and unable to run. Grant Holloway did not talk his way out. Priscilla did not summon a lawyer fast enough to matter. And my son, my restless, brilliant boy, was led out of a country club dining room in front of the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. Margaret and I walked out together, exactly as she had said we would, into the parking lot, into the cool night air, 2 people in their good clothes, who had just watched their only son's life collapse because they had refused to let other people be destroyed to protect him. I did not feel victorious. I want to keep saying that, because I think it matters. I felt hollowed out and unspeakably tired, and, underneath everything, a small, terrible relief that it was finally done. Margaret held my arm as we crossed the lot. Neither of us spoke until we were in the car. Then she said, "You did the right thing, Walter. The hardest right thing I've ever seen anyone do." I said, "I know." And then I said, "But he was ours." And she said, "Yes, he was." And we sat in that parking lot and grieved our living son for a long time before I finally started the car and drove us home. The days after the dinner did not feel like a victory either. They felt like the beginning of a long, grinding cleanup, which is exactly what they were. I had imagined, in some naive corner of my mind, that once the truth came out, things would resolve quickly, that the money would come back, that the guilty would face what they'd earned, that Margaret and I could return to some version of the quiet life we'd wanted. I understand now how foolish that was. Bringing a structure down is fast. Clearing the rubble and rebuilding is slow. The demolition took minutes. The aftermath took the better part of a year, and in some ways, it is not fully over even now. The first thing that happened was that it became public. I had not fully braced for that. When a fraud of that size collapses, and when it involves not just stolen investments, but the starving of senior care facilities, it does not stay quiet. There were news stories. Grant Holloway's name, which had been spoken in reverent tones in country clubs, began appearing in headlines attached to words like fraud and exploitation. And because these stories always seek out the human details, some of them found their way to the fact that the whole thing had been brought down by an investor's own father-in-law, an engineer, an old man. I did not seek that attention, and I did not enjoy it. A few reporters found their way to our door, and I told them I had nothing to say, which was true. I did not do any of this to become a story. I did it because I had found something terrible, and I was the only one positioned to stop it. But I could not fully control how it was told, and there was a strange, uncomfortable period where strangers knew our names and had opinions about what we'd done. Some of those opinions were cruel. I want to be honest about that, because I think people imagine that doing the right thing is met with universal approval, and it is not. There were people, some of them connected to Grant's social world, who felt that I had betrayed my own family, that a father should protect his son no matter what, that whatever Grant and Ethan had done, airing it publicly and bringing the authorities into a family matter, was a kind of treason. I received letters. A few of them were vicious. I read every one of them, and then I made peace with the fact that those people had never sat across a table from Dorothy Keller and watched her cry without making a sound. They had never traced a loan against a starving nursing home. They were defending an abstract principle about family loyalty, and I had been forced to choose between that abstract principle and the concrete safety of real, vulnerable people. I chose the people. I would choose them again. And I stopped reading the letters after a while, because a man cannot spend his last decades defending a choice he knows was right, to people who have decided it was wrong. The harder judgment came from closer in. Priscilla's family, of course, turned on us completely, which I had expected. But there were people in our own wider circle, some relatives, a few old acquaintances, who grew cold, who felt that we had done something unforgivable in helping to prosecute our own son. I lost friendships I had held for decades. I understand why. It is a genuinely hard thing, and I do not pretend that reasonable people cannot disagree about where a parent's loyalty should end. But I had heard my son at that table. Those who condemned me had not. And I found that I could not explain the weight of what I'd heard to someone who had not been there. And after a while, I stopped trying. Margaret bore the social cost even harder than I did in some ways. Because women in our world are judged differently for these things, and there was an ugly undercurrent of blame directed at her, as if a good enough mother would have found a way to protect her son, and a good enough wife would have stopped her husband. She carried it with a dignity that made me love her more than I already did, which I would not have thought possible. She said to me once, quietly, that she had spent 30 years protecting other people's children in her classroom, and she was not going to be lectured about motherhood by people who would have let a nursing home be starved to protect their own comfort. She did not raise her voice when she said it. She never does. But I understood, in that moment, exactly where our son had failed to inherit the thing that mattered most. The investigation itself unfolded over months, and I was a witness to it, in the way a witness is, which is to say, I was called on when needed, and told very little the rest of the time. I gave my account, more than once, in formal settings, under the guidance of people whose job it was to build the case into something that would hold. I handed over, again and officially, everything I had gathered. My 4 months of notes turned out to be genuinely useful, not because the authorities couldn't have found it themselves, but because I had already traced the shell structure and mapped the flow of money, and that saved time, and in a case involving ongoing harm to vulnerable people, time mattered. I learned things during that period that deepened the horror of what we'd uncovered. The senior facilities were worse than the initial file had suggested. Once investigators had the authority to look properly, they found that the understaffing had been more severe and more deliberate than even Frank had realized. There were residents who had been genuinely harmed, not in ways I am going to detail, but in ways that made me grateful beyond words, that we had compressed our timeline and moved when we did. Every week earlier that we broke it open was a week those facilities got the attention and the resources they had been denied. I have thought many times since about what would have happened if Margaret had not taken a wrong turn looking for a bathroom. If she had found the actual powder room and never seen that deed. the whole thing would have kept running, and those people would have kept being hurt, and no one would have known. It is a strange and humbling thing to realize that the safety of strangers turned on a wrong turn in a hallway. The financial recovery was its own long process, and I want to be careful and honest about it, because I know that people watching a story like this want to hear that everyone got everything back, and the truth is more complicated than that. When a Ponzi scheme collapses, the money is mostly gone. That is the nature of it. It has been spent on lifestyle and on paying earlier victims and on servicing debt. What can be recovered is whatever assets remain, and those assets are then, through a long legal process, gathered and eventually distributed among the victims. Ethan's enormous house was one such asset. The cars, various accounts that had not yet been drained, Grant Holloway's own considerable holdings, to the extent they could be seized and were not themselves encumbered by the fraudulent loans. It took most of a year, but a recovery process was established, and assets were marshaled, and eventually the victims began to receive distributions. Margaret and I got a significant portion of our $240,000 back. Not all of it. I want to say that plainly, because I think the honest number matters more than a fairy tale. We recovered a little more than 60% of what we had put in. The rest was gone, spent on a house and a life that had been built to impress the very people it was stealing from. But here is the thing that mattered far more to me than our own recovery. Dorothy Keller got a meaningful portion of her $110,000 back. Harold Winters got enough back, and quickly enough once the process began, that his wife was able to have her procedure. The 9 households that had trusted me, that had signed on to help even when it terrified them, were made substantially whole. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough that people who had been facing genuine ruin were pulled back from the edge. And the senior facilities were taken out of Grant Holloway's control entirely, and placed with operators whose only job was to actually care for the people living there. That, more than any dollar figure, was the thing I held on to. 3 buildings full of vulnerable elderly people were made safe again because a wrong turn in a hallway had set an old engineer to work. I visited one of those facilities, once, after it had been stabilized. I did not announce who I was. I just wanted to see it. I sat in the lobby for an hour and watched staff who were no longer stretched too thin actually attend to the people in their care, and I watched an old man in a wheelchair being helped into the sun by a nurse who had time to be gentle, and I thought about how close that man had come to being a line item in Grant Holloway's collapse, and I had to go out to my car for a while before I could drive home. Margaret asked me, when I got back, if seeing it had helped. I said it had. I said it was the first time since the party that I felt like the whole thing had been worth what it cost us. She understood. She always does. I owe you the specific consequences, because I think when someone tells you a story like this, you deserve to know exactly what happened to each person, and not just a vague assurance that justice was done. Grant Holloway faced the most. He was the architect. The fund was his. The appraisal company was his. The loans against the senior facilities were his. And the whole structure had been built to enrich him above everyone else. The financial fraud alone was enormous, but it was the harm to the senior facilities that made his case something far graver than a white-collar matter. When it was all finally resolved, Grant Holloway was sentenced to 19 years. I remember the number precisely because I sat in the room when it was read, and I watched a man who had spent his life certain that rules bent for him understand that this rule would not. He was 63 years old. 19 years at 63 is very likely the rest of a life. He did not look expansive anymore. He looked like what he had always actually been underneath the voice and the confidence, which was a thief who had finally run out of room. Priscilla faced less than her father, but more than she ever believed she would. She had positioned herself, throughout, as merely the wife, the beneficiary, the woman who spent the money without asking where it came from. But her comment at that dinner table, the one about the winter's withdrawal, the one I heard with my own ears, established that she knew. She knew the money was being moved to silence a victim. She was not a passive spouse. She was a participant, and the evidence proved it. She was sentenced to 6 years. Priscilla, who had measured my wife's china for 11 years, who had called our modest life charmingly authentic, went to prison for 6 years. And the last time I saw her face, in that courtroom, the measuring look was gone from it forever. And then there was Ethan. I have been dreading writing this part. Even now, even after all this time, because there is no version of my son's consequence that I can tell you about with anything other than grief. Ethan was load-bearing in the fraud. His development was the asset the whole thing was built around. He had recruited investors, including his own parents. He had coordinated the fraudulent appraisals, and he had sat at his own dinner table and discussed, in his own words, how to use his parents' savings to silence another victim. The evidence against him was overwhelming, in no small part because so much of it came from a father who had refused to look away. His lawyers, and he had good ones for a while, until the money to pay them ran out, argued that he had been under Grant's influence, that he was less culpable than his father-in-law, that he had gotten swept into something larger than himself, and there was probably some truth in that. Ethan had not designed the machine. Grant had. But Ethan had run it willingly and profited from it enormously, and the notion that a grown man in his 40s was merely a helpless instrument of his father-in-law did not survive contact with the evidence of how actively he had participated. My son was sentenced to 11 years. I was in the room for that too. I had been in the room for all of it, every proceeding I was permitted to attend, because I had decided early on that if I was going to do this to my son, I was not going to do it from a distance. I was not going to bring his life down and then look away from the consequences. If he had to face it, I would face it with him, even if he did not want me there. And he did not want me there. He would not look at me through any of it, not once. When they read the 11 years, I watched my boy's shoulders fold inward, and I felt something in my own chest tear that has not fully healed, and I do not expect ever will. 11 years. He would be in his 50s when he came out. Priscilla would be gone from his life by then, their marriage a casualty of the collapse, like everything else. The house was gone. The life was gone. Everything my restless, brilliant boy had built to prove he was somebody had been revealed as a theft and taken away, and he would spend more than a decade in a cell thinking about it. I tried to see him. I need to tell you that, because I think it matters to who I am and who Margaret is. After the sentencing, once things had settled, I tried to visit my son. I wrote to him first. I told him that I loved him, that I would always love him, that what I had done because I could not let vulnerable people be hurt, and that loving him and stopping him had never been opposites in my heart, even though I knew they must feel like opposites in his. I told him that whenever he was willing to see me, I would come. For a long time, he was not willing. My letters went unanswered. Margaret wrote too, and hers went unanswered as well, and I watched my wife absorb that silence, with a grief that was quieter and deeper than mine, because a mother's is always different. But I want to end this part with something true, because it would be dishonest to leave you thinking the door stayed shut forever. About 8 months after the sentencing, a letter came. It was short. It was not forgiveness. I want to be careful not to dress it up into something it wasn't, because that would cheapen the real and painful thing that it was. My son wrote a few lines. He said he was not ready to see me. He said he was angry, and that he did not know if the anger would ever fully go. But he also said, at the very end, One thing that I have read more times than I can count. He said that in the quiet, with nothing left to distract him, and no one left to impress, he had started to understand what he had actually been part of, the senior facilities, what that had really meant. And he said that he understood, now, that I had not been able to protect him from that without letting it continue, and that he did not forgive me, but that he no longer thought I was wrong. That was all. He did not sign it with love, he signed it with just his name. But it was a door that was no longer fully closed, and after 8 months of silence, a door that is merely mostly closed feels like the sun coming up. Margaret and I have decided to be patient. It is the thing we are both best at now. We write to him. We do not push. We have told him that whenever he is ready, in a year or in 5, we will be there, and that the anger is allowed, and that our love does not have a deadline. He is our son. He did a terrible thing, and he is facing it, and he is still our son. Both of those things remain true at the same time, the way they have been true since the night at the dinner table. Being a parent, I have learned, is largely the practice of holding two things that should not be able to exist together, and refusing to let go of either one. I want to go back, now, to something I skipped over, because I have been telling this story in a way that makes it sound cleaner and more certain than it was while I was living it. I owe you the uncertainty too. There were nights, all through those 4 months of gathering evidence, when I nearly stopped. I have made it sound like I decided in the car, outside Ethan's house, and never wavered. That is not the truth. The truth is that almost every night, some part of me argued for the other path, the part of me that was his father. It would wake me at 3 in the morning with a simple, devastating question. What if I just warned him? What if I pulled him aside, told him what I knew, and gave him the chance to walk away, to make it right quietly, to save himself before it all came down? He was my son. Surely a father's first duty was to his own child. I want to walk you through how I answered that question on those nights, because I think it is the most important thing in this entire story, more important than any twist or any consequence. I answered it by thinking about Dorothy Keller working 2 days a week at a pharmacy at 76. I answered it by thinking about Harold Winters, stalled for 2 months on the withdrawal his wife needed for a procedure. I answered it by thinking about the residents in those 3 senior facilities, people I had never met, being made less safe every single day so the machine could keep running. And I made myself understand, on each of those nights, that warning Ethan would not just be an act of love toward my son. It would also be an act of violence toward all of those people, because warning Ethan meant warning Grant, and warning Grant meant the money moved and the documents vanished, and the whole thing either collapsed in a way that left the victims with nothing, or worse, was papered over and kept running. There was no version of saving my son that did not require sacrificing everyone else. I turned it over 1,000 ways, and it always came out the same. To protect Ethan, I would have to let Dorothy and Harold and 11 households and 3 buildings full of strangers be destroyed, and I could not do that. I decided, on those long nights, that a love which required the ruin of the vulnerable was not a love I could act on, no matter how much it lived in my chest. I have made peace with that decision. But I want to be honest, that making peace with a decision is not the same as the decision ceasing to hurt. It still hurts. It will always hurt. I did the right thing, and it cost me my son's freedom and, for a long time, his willingness to even look at me, and both of those facts are permanent, and I live with both of them every day. Anyone who tells you that doing the right thing feels good has never done a right thing that cost them this much. It does not feel good. It feels necessary. Those are different words, and the difference between them is where I have lived for the past year. Margaret and I have talked about this more than we have talked about anything else in our 44 years. She carries her own version of the question. Hers is a mother's, and it is worse than mine in some ways, because a mother's guilt attaches itself to things no mother could have controlled. She has asked herself whether she failed Ethan somewhere, decades ago, in some small way that set him on the path to that dinner table. Whether she was too soft or too hard, or too absent or too present. I have watched my wife interrogate her entire history as a mother looking for the flaw that made our son into a man who could starve a nursing home. And I have held her while she did it, and I have told her the truth, which is that Ethan's choices were Ethan's. We raised him in a home with no fraud in it. We taught him, by example, over decades, what it looks like to earn things honestly, and to keep your word, and to care about people who cannot do anything for you. He saw all of that, every day, for 18 years, and he chose something else. Not because we failed to show him the right path, but because at some point he decided the right path was too slow, and the shortcut was too tempting, and the people he could hurt on the way were too abstract to matter. That was not our failure. It was his choice. A person can be raised well and still choose badly. If that were not true, then no parent would ever be safe, because no parent can control the moment their grown child decides who they are going to be. Margaret is coming to believe that, slowly. Some days she believes it. Some days the 3 a.m. question wins. I hold her on the days it wins. The way she held me in the car outside the country club, and we take turns being the strong one, which is what 44 years of marriage turns out to be. Not two people who are strong at the same time. Two people who are never weak at the same time. Our life is smaller now, and in some ways better, and I did not expect to be able to say that. We lost a great deal. Money, yes, though we recovered enough to be secure. But we lost friendships, and standing, and the simple pleasure of being an ordinary family, with an ordinary successful son. There is a hole in our holidays now that will never be filled. There is an empty place at our table. There are grandchildren we will very likely never have. A whole imagined future that evaporated in a country club dining room. I grieve that future. I did not just lose my son to a prison sentence. I lost the version of the rest of my life in which he was in it, freely and happily. And that version is not coming back, even when he is eventually released, because too much has broken to ever be exactly repaired. But we gained things too, and I want to name them, because a story that is only about loss is not a true story either. We gained 9 households of people who are, now, something like family to us. Dorothy Keller comes to dinner once a month. She and Margaret have become genuinely close. 2 women in their 70s who found each other through the worst thing that ever happened to either of them, and who have built something warm on the other side of it. Harold Winters and his wife, whose procedure went well, send us a card every holiday. The people I sat with in living rooms and coffee shops and the back booth of a diner, telling them the worst news of their retirements, became the community that carried Margaret and me through the aftermath. We had lost old friends who could not accept what we'd done. We gained new ones who were alive and secure and whole because of what we'd done. It was not an even trade, but it was not nothing, and on the good days it feels like more than nothing. And I gained something harder to name. I gained the knowledge of what I am actually made of, which is a thing most people go their whole lives without ever being forced to learn. For 69 years, I had believed certain things about myself. That I was honest, that I was careful, that I would do the right thing if it were ever truly required of me. But belief is cheap when it is never tested. Any man can believe he would run into a burning building. Very few are ever standing outside one that is actually on fire, with someone they love inside it, being asked to choose. I was asked to choose, and I learned that the things I had believed about myself were true, but that being true had a price I had never imagined. and that I was willing to pay it. I would rather not have learned that lesson. I would give a great deal to have never been tested. But I was, and I passed, and there is a hard, quiet dignity in knowing that which I would not trade back, even for the easier life I lost. There is a question I have been asked more than any other, by the few people I have told this to in full, and it is a question worth answering directly. People ask me how I did it. How a 69-year-old retired engineer, with no background in finance or law or investigation, managed to uncover and document a fraud that had fooled dozens of sophisticated people, including his own family, for years. And the honest answer is that I did not do anything a good engineer does not do every single day of his career. Let me explain that, because I think it is the part of this story that might actually be useful to someone watching, as opposed to merely dramatic. A structure and a fraud are more alike than most people realize. Both are systems designed to distribute a load. In a building, the load is weight, and the system distributes it down through beams and columns to the ground. In a fraud, the load is suspicion, and the system distributes it too, spreading it thin across 100 reassurances so that no single point ever bears enough doubt to fail. My entire career had been the practice of finding the one connection in a complicated system that everyone had stopped checking because they trusted it. That is exactly what a fraud is. It is a system built entirely out of connections that people have stopped checking because they trust them. Grant Holloway's fraud worked because everyone trusted a different piece of it, and no one checked the whole. The investors trusted Grant. Grant pointed to the appraisals. The appraisals were done by a company nobody thought to trace. The company was owned through shells nobody thought to unwind. Ethan trusted that his parents were too grateful to ask questions. Everyone in the system was holding up their small piece of trust, and the whole thing stood because no single person ever tried to trace the load all the way to the ground. I traced it to the ground. That is all. That is the entire secret. I did not have special access or special expertise in finance. I had 41 years of refusing to sign off on a structure, until I had personally followed the load path from the top of the building all the way down to the bedrock, and I applied that same refusal to my son's fund. I started at the returns, which were the top of the structure, the thing everyone could see, and I asked the question I had asked 10,000 times in my career. What is actually holding this up? And I followed the answer down, connection by connection, refusing to accept any explanation on trust, until I reached the bottom and found that there was no bedrock at all. The whole thing was holding itself up on nothing but paper, and the reluctance of decent people to check. The reluctance of decent people to check. I have thought about that phrase a great deal, because that reluctance is not a flaw. It is a virtue, most of the time. A society in which everyone checks everything, in which no one trusts anyone, is a miserable and unworkable society. Trust is what lets us build things together. Trust is the material that holds a family and a community and an economy together. I do not want to live in a world where people are so suspicious that no fraud can ever succeed, because that same suspicion would strangle every good and generous thing that people build on the assumption of each other's honesty. But trust has to be verified at the points that matter. That is the whole lesson of my career, and, it turned out, the whole lesson of the worst year of my life. You do not have to check everything. You cannot. But you have to check the connections that are bearing the most load. The place where the most weight rests is exactly the place you most need to inspect, precisely because that is where a failure would be catastrophic. And I had violated my own life's principle at the one connection that mattered most. I had put the great majority of our savings, Margaret's safety net, into a system I did not check, because the connection was my own son, and I could not bear to inspect him. That was my failure, and I have owned it throughout this whole story, and I own it now. The fraud was Grant's crime and Ethan's crime, but the vulnerability was mine. I handed them the opening, and I have made a kind of peace with that too, because the same instinct that made me fail to check my son, the deep human unwillingness to treat family as a suspect, is not something I actually want to lose. I would rather be a man who trusts his son too much and pays for it than a man who treats his own child as a mark to be verified. Even now, even after everything. I do not want to become a person who could not have been fooled by his own son, because that person would have to be colder than I ever want to be. So I do not tell this story as a warning to trust no one. I tell it as something more careful than that. Trust freely, because a life without trust is not worth living. But when the load is heavy, when it is your safety net, your home, your future, the thing that would be catastrophic to lose, then check. Not because the people you love are probably lying. They are probably not. But because the whole point of a safety net is that it holds, and you cannot know it holds unless you have followed the load all the way to the ground. Margaret puts it more simply than I do. She says, trust people, but read the documents. She is, as usual, correct, and she gets there in 6 words, where I need 600. 44 years, and she is still the sharper of the two of us. I built things that hold up buildings. She reads the room and cuts to the center of the thing. Between the two of us, we finally traced the load all the way down. Neither of us could have done it alone. I needed her radar to know something was wrong. She needed my engineering to prove why. That is a marriage, in the end. 2 different instruments, pointed at the same truth. There is one more thing from the investigation period I want to tell you, because it is the moment I understood that we had truly won, not in a courtroom, but in a way that mattered more. It happened at one of the senior facilities, the same one I told you I had visited and sat in the lobby of, the one where I watched an old man being helped into the sun. A few months after that first quiet visit, I went back, and this time I did not sit anonymously in the lobby. Frank had arranged, through the new operators, for me to meet some of the families. Not to be thanked, exactly, though there was some of that, and it was uncomfortable, because I have never known what to do with gratitude for something that also cost me my son. I went because the new operators thought the families should be able to meet the person who had, without ever intending to, made their parents safe again. I sat in a small community room, and one by one, adult children of the residents came in and shook my hand. Sons and daughters my own age, people who had entrusted their mothers and fathers to that place, believing it was safe, who had no idea that behind the pleasant lobby, their parents had been quietly endangered to service a fraud. Most of them had never known the danger existed. They only knew that at some point the place had changed hands and gotten better, more staff, more care, more attention, and that a man had been part of making that happen. One woman, about my age, sat down across from me and held my hand and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she told me about her father, who had dementia and who lived in the memory unit, the same understaffed memory unit where a resident had once wandered out. She told me that before the change, she had lain awake at night terrified, because she could tell something was wrong, that her father was not being watched closely enough, but she had no proof, and no power, and nowhere to turn. And she told me that now, since the change, she slept. That was the word she used. She said, "I sleep now." She said it like it was the most enormous gift a person could receive, and I understood that for her, it was. I drove home from that visit, and I had to stop the car twice, because I could not see the road. Because that was the thing, you see. That woman would never know my son. She would never know the dinner table, or the deed on the wall, or the 4 months, or the 11 years, or the empty place at my table. She only knew that she slept now, and I understood, sitting in my car on the side of the road, that this was the actual answer to the 3 a.m. question that had haunted me for months. This was why I could not warn Ethan. Not for an abstract principle. For her. So that a stranger my own age could sleep at night knowing her father with dementia was finally safe. I would make the trade again. I want to say that as clearly as I can. At the end of all this, I lost my son's freedom and, for a long time, his love, and I would make the same choice again, because the alternative was that woman lying awake in terror, and her father in danger, and Dorothy at the pharmacy, and Harold's wife without her procedure, and 3 buildings full of the most vulnerable people there are, being quietly sacrificed to a lie. I would make the trade again. It would break my heart again. Both of those things would be true again, the way they have been true this entire time. 6 months after the last of the sentences came down, Margaret and I sat on our back porch, on a warm evening, in the yard where I had once taught Ethan to throw a ball, and we talked about what to do with the money we had recovered. We did not need most of it, as it turned out. Our life had grown small, and our needs were few. And the 60-odd% we had gotten back, combined with what we had wisely kept out of the fund in the first place, was more than enough to see us through whatever years we had left. And so we found ourselves, strangely, in a position we had never expected. We had recovered money that we did not need to spend on ourselves. Margaret was the one who knew what to do with it. Of course she was. She said we should give it to the facilities. Not the operators, who were doing fine, the residents. Specifically, she wanted to fund something at the memory unit, the understaffed one, the one where the woman's father lived, the one that had haunted both of us most. She wanted to create something that would make sure that unit was never understaffed again, that there was always money set aside, so that the thing that had nearly happened to those people could never happen for lack of resources. We did it. We took the majority of what we had recovered, more than we kept for ourselves, and we established a fund attached to that memory unit. Its entire purpose is to ensure adequate staffing and care, permanently, so that no family ever again lies awake the way that woman had. It is not enormous, by the standards of the fraud that created the need for it, but it is enough to matter. Enough to guarantee that unit a margin of safety it did not have before, and it will keep mattering long after Margaret and I are gone. We did not put our own names on it. We are not that kind of people, and besides, I did not do any of this to have my name on a wall, but we did name it. We thought about it for a long time, sitting on that porch, and in the end, we named it after the thing we most wanted it to stand for. We called it the Steady Hand Fund, because that is what those residents needed, and had been denied, and would now always have, a steady hand. Someone with the time to be gentle. A nurse who could help an old man into the sun without rushing. There is a small plaque at the entrance to that memory unit. It does not have our names. It just says the name of the fund, and underneath, a single line that Margaret chose. It says, "So that no one is left unwatched." I go and read it sometimes. It is the closest thing to a monument that will ever exist, to the worst and most important year of my life. Not my son's name in a headline, not Grant Holloway's sentence, just a small plaque on a memory unit, promising strangers a steady hand, which is the only thing I ever actually wanted out of any of it. It is a little more than a year now since the night at the housewarming party, and I want to tell you where things stand, because I think you have earned a real ending, and not a tidy one. Grant Holloway is where he will remain for a very long time. I do not think about him much anymore, which surprises me. I expected to carry more anger toward him than I do. But anger, it turns out, requires that a person still occupy space in your mind, and Grant Holloway has quietly vacated mine. He was a thief who ran out of room. There is nothing more to understand about him than that. Priscilla I think about even less. She was a symptom, not a cause. The measuring, the little hooks in every kindness, the 11 years of appraising my wife's china, all of it was the surface of a person who had learned to see other human beings as assets and liabilities, and who married into a family that ran on exactly that arithmetic. She is paying for her part. I hope, without much confidence, that the years give her something the country club never did, which is the ability to see a person and not a price. I do not expect it, but I hope it. Ethan. I think about every single day. Our correspondence continues, slowly. He has written 4 times now since that first short letter. The letters are still careful, still guarded, still a long way from anything I would call reconciliation. But they are getting a little longer each time, and a little more like the boy I knew underneath the man I lost. In the most recent one, he asked about the garden. Just that. He asked whether the tomatoes had come in this year. It was such a small, ordinary human question, the kind of thing he would have asked before any of it, and I sat with that letter for a long time before I could answer it. I told him the tomatoes had come in. I told him his mother's roses were the best they'd been in years. I told him we loved him. I did not push for more than he had offered. Patience. It is the only thing I have to give him now, and it happens to be the thing I have the most of. Margaret is well. Her heart, the physical one that started all of this 4 years ago with a surgery and a safety net, is strong and steady. The doctors are pleased. She gardens, and she has Dorothy over for dinner, and she has taken up, of all things, teaching again, volunteering twice a week at a literacy program for adults, because she cannot stop being who she is, which is a woman who protects the people the world has stopped paying attention to. I watch her with those adult students, patient and warm, and completely present, and I understand all over again why our son's coldness was his own invention and not a thing he learned in our house. He grew up watching this woman. He simply chose not to become her. That was his loss, in the most literal sense. He lost the chance to be like his mother, and there is no greater loss than that, and he inflicted it on himself. As for me, I am 69 years old, and I have retired for the 2nd time, this time from the only case I ever worked that was not made of steel. I spend my mornings in the garden. I spend my afternoons, some of them, on the porch, thinking, which is a thing I did not use to allow myself, and now understand is not the same as idleness. And I spend a little of my time telling this story, to the few who can hear it, because I have come to believe that the lesson buried in it might be worth more than my own privacy. The lesson is not the one people expect. People expect the lesson to be about revenge, or about justice, or about the satisfaction of watching bad people get what they deserve. But I felt no satisfaction in any of the sentences, and I do not tell this story for the pleasure of the reveal. The lesson, the real one, is quieter and harder. The lesson is that being underestimated is not the insult it feels like. For most of my life, I bristled at being taken for granted, at being seen as the reliable old man in the corner, the one nobody worried about. And then, at the end of my life, that exact underestimation became the thing that let me save everyone who needed saving. Grant Holloway and my own son looked at me and saw furniture, and because they saw furniture, they spoke freely in front of me, and they let me walk anywhere, and they never once guarded themselves against the thing I turned out to be. The whole plan worked because they could not imagine the quiet old man was dangerous. I have thought a great deal about a particular kind of animal over this last year. The kind everyone in the wild underestimates, right up until the single moment they should not have. There is a reason the old ones survive. It is not that they are the fastest or the strongest anymore. Those years are behind them. It is that they have learned the one thing the young never believe. which is that patience is a weapon, and that the animal who waits, who watches, who lets the herd forget it is the most dangerous animal on the plain. Not because it is cruel, because it is certain. It does not move until moving will end the matter. And then it moves once. I was that. For 4 months. I do not know that I have it in me to be that again, and I hope to God I never have to. But I know now that it was in me, waiting, all along, underneath 41 years of being the careful one, and the reliable one, and the man who trusted his son too much. Underneath all of that, there was an old thing that knew how to wait, and how to watch, and how to bring a whole structure down, with a single, patient, well-placed truth. They looked at an old lion, asleep in the sun, and they thought he had no teeth left. They were wrong about the teeth. And they were wrong, most of all, about the patience, because the patience was the teeth. The waiting was the weapon the entire time. That is the end of my story. My son is in prison, and he asked about the tomatoes. My wife is teaching again, and her heart is strong. 9 families are whole, and 3 buildings are safe, and a small plaque on a memory unit promises strangers a steady hand. I lost a great deal, and I would make the same choice again, and both of those things are true, and always will be. If you have listened this far, then this story reached someone, and that is the only reason I told it. So let me ask you to do the small thing that helps it reach the next person. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if any part of this felt true to your own life, share it. Because someone else watching may need to hear that the quiet ones are not weak, and that being underestimated can be the last strength you have left. Like this video, and subscribe to Old Lion Stories, and stay a while. There is always another story, and there is always a seat here for you. I built things that were meant to last, my whole life. In the end, the thing I am proudest of building was not made of steel, it was made of patience, and it held.